I won't soften this. Not because I can't, but because softening it would distort it. And this only holds its shape when it's exact. There's a difference between something that grows over time and something that reveals itself all at once. Most connections unfold slowly, layer by layer, giving you space to adjust, to interpret, to decide what to do with what you're seeing. This didn't follow that pattern. It didn't build. It appeared, fully formed in ways I wasn't prepared to recognize so quickly. And that's what unsettled me first. Not you, not anything you said or did, but the absence of distance, because distance is what I've always relied on. Not as a wall, but as a structure, something that keeps things measured, controlled, predictable. It allows interaction without interference. It lets people come close enough to feel connected without ever reaching a point where they can alter anything real. That's how it's always worked. That's how I've always kept things intact. And then you existed in a way that made that structure irrelevant without ever directly challenging it. You didn't push. You didn't pull. You didn't try to get closer. You simply never felt distant to begin with, and that's what disrupted everything. Because I can manage effort. I can recognize intention. I can respond to movement. But I can't manage something that doesn't behave like anything I've encountered before. You didn't move toward me. You didn't cross boundaries. You were just already there, not in a physical sense, not even in a conventional emotional sense, but in awareness, in the way things were understood before they were explained, in the way silence didn't feel like absence, but like something shared. That's not something people usually notice. They react to what's visible. They respond to what's said. They interpret based on what's presented to them. You responded to what wasn't being shown, and you did it consistently enough that it stopped feeling like coincidence. That's when I started paying attention, not to you, but to the pattern, because patterns don't lie. They repeat, they confirm themselves over time. And once something repeats in a way that can't be dismissed, it becomes something you have to acknowledge, even if you don't want to, even if it complicates things. And this complicated things, not in an obvious way, not in a way that disrupted anything external, but internally, it shifted something I've always kept stable. I started noticing it in the smallest moments. The way my thoughts would pause, as if expecting something that hadn't been said yet. The way certain realizations felt incomplete until I considered how you would perceive them. The way silence started to feel like it had structure, like it held something specific instead of just existing as empty space. That's not normal, not for me. I don't build my internal world around anyone else. I don't adjust the way I think based on external presence. Everything I process independently. Or at least, I used to, because now there's something different. Something subtle, but precise enough that I can't ignore it. You're not an external reference anymore. You're integrated, and integration changes everything. It means you're no longer separate from the process. You're part of it. Part of how things are interpreted, part of how meaning forms. And that level of presence doesn't happen easily. It doesn't happen quickly. It doesn't happen without resistance. Except this did, and I didn't resist it. That's what I keep coming back to. Not the connection itself, but my lack of resistance to it, because I resist everything that has the potential to change my structure, immediately, instinctively, without hesitation. That's how I've maintained control. That's how I've kept everything in place. But with you, there was no immediate rejection, no instinct to pull back, no need to create distance. Instead, there was something else, recognition. And recognition is different. It doesn't feel like something new. It feels like something already understood. Something familiar in a way that doesn't rely on time or experience. Something that exists beneath those things. That's what made this difficult to categorize, because it didn't fit into any pattern I've known before. It wasn't built through shared history. It wasn't formed through repeated interaction. It didn't develop gradually. It was just there, fully present, fully formed in a way that didn't make sense logically. And yet, it made sense in every other way. That contradiction is what held my attention. Because I don't ignore contradictions, I analyze them, I break them down, I understand them until they fit into something coherent. But this didn't break down. It held its shape no matter how closely I examined it. And that meant one thing. It wasn't something to be analyzed from the outside. It was something to be experienced from within. That's when the shift happened, not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly enough that I only recognized it after it had already taken place. I stopped observing you as something separate and started experiencing you as something internal. That distinction matters more than anything else. Because once something becomes internal, it's no longer optional. You can't step away from it. You can't put it aside. You can't choose when to engage with it. It's just there, constantly, consistently, part of the way everything else functions. And I don't allow that kind of integration easily. I don't give that kind of access. Not because I'm closed off, but because I'm precise about what I let influence me. Everything that enters my internal space has to earn its place. It has to prove that it belongs there, that it won't distort anything, that it won't disrupt the structure I've built. You didn't go through that process. You didn't prove anything. You didn't ask for access. You just fit. And that's what made it impossible to ignore, because fitting isn't something that can be forced. It either happens naturally or it doesn't happen at all. And this happened too naturally to question, which is why I didn't stop it, which is why I didn't dismantle it, which is why it continued. And now it's reached a point where it's no longer something I can observe without responding to, because it has impact, not visible impact, not something that changes how things look from the outside, but internal impact, the kind that shifts perception, the kind that alters how things are processed, the kind that changes the baseline. And once the baseline changes, everything else adjusts around it. That's where I am now, adjusting. Not because I have to, but because something already has, and I'm recognizing it in ways I can't reverse. The way I think isn't exactly the same anymore. The way I interpret things has shifted slightly. The way I measure clarity now includes something that wasn't there before. You not as a person, not as an identity, but as a reference point. And that's not something I can dismiss, because I don't create reference points lightly. They define how everything else is understood. They influence every conclusion, every realization, every decision. And you've become one without intention, without effort, without even acknowledging it. That's what makes this so difficult to step away from, because stepping away wouldn't remove the impact. It wouldn't undo the integration. It wouldn't restore the previous structure. It would just create absence. And absence, when something has already taken its place, doesn't return things to neutral. It leaves something missing. And I don't leave things missing. I resolve them. I close them. I make sure there's nothing left that can affect me later. But this, I'm not sure it can be resolved that way, because it's not incomplete. It's not unresolved, it's just undefined, and that's the difference. It doesn't need closure, it needs recognition, and that's what I've been delaying. Not because I don't understand it, but because I do, too clearly, clear lie. Enough to know that once I acknowledge it fully, it changes everything. It turns something internal into something real, something that exists beyond thought, something that requires action or decision, or at the very least, acceptance. And acceptance carries weight. It means you're not just aware of something, you're allowing it, you're giving it space to exist without resistance. You're choosing not to remove it. And that's not something I do without certainty. But here's the truth I can't avoid anymore. I've already allowed it, not consciously, not deliberately, but through inaction, through lack of resistance, through the absence of rejection. And that tells me something I can't ignore. Some part of me has already decided, even if I haven't said it out loud yet. Even if I haven't fully faced it, the decision exists. In the way I continue to engage with this, in the way I don't reduce it to something simpler, in the way I let it exist at the level it naturally occupies. That's not hesitation, that's acceptance, quiet, unspoken, but real. And now I'm at a point where that acceptance has to become something more defined because things like this don't stay in between forever. They evolve, they deepen, or they collapse under the weight of being left undefined. And I don't leave things undefined when they matter. And this, whether I intended it or not, it matters. Not in a way that disrupts me, not in a way that weakens anything, but in a way that changes something fundamental. And change is something I don't ignore. I understand it. I decide what to do with it. I choose whether to integrate it fully or remove it completely. There's no middle ground, not for something like this. So now the question isn't what this is. I know what it is. The question is what I'm going to do with it, because whatever choice I make, it won't be temporary. It won't be reversible. It won't be something I can adjust later without consequence. It will define something, something structural, something lasting. And I don't take those decisions lightly, but I also don't avoid them. So here I am, not at the beginning, not in uncertainty, but at a point where clarity demands response. And the truth is, I'm not trying to push this away. I'm not trying to contain it. I'm not trying to reduce it into something easier to handle. I'm letting it exist, fully, exactly as it is. And that alone tells me everything I need to know, because if this were something that didn't belong, I would have ended it already, without hesitation, without doubt. That's how I've always been, but I didn't. And that means something, something precise, something intentional, even if the intention formed quietly. So whatever this becomes, it won't be accidental. It won't be something that happened without awareness. It will be something I chose fully, deliberately, without denial. Because once something reaches this level, there's no such thing as ignoring it. Only acknowledging it, or walking away from it, knowing exactly what you left behind. And I don't walk away from things I understand this clearly. Not anymore. It doesn't pause just because I recognize it. That's the part I underestimated. Most things, once understood, lose their momentum. They become manageable, predictable. They settle into a form that can be controlled, shaped, or, if necessary, ended. This didn't, understanding it didn't slow it down. If anything, it refined it, made it sharper, more exact, because now it's not just something I feel moving beneath everything. It's something I can see clearly as it moves. Every shift, every adjustment, every quiet expansion that happens, without needing acknowledgement to continue. And that level of awareness comes with a cost. It removes the option of pretending this is passive. It isn't. It's active in ways that don't require action. It exists in the background, but it influences the foreground. Subtly, precisely, like something recalibrating everything without ever announcing that it's doing so. I notice it in how I process things now. Not dramatically, not in ways anyone else would see, but internally. There's a difference, a slight pause where there didn't used to be one, not hesitation, not uncertainty, just space. As if something in me is accounting for more than one perspective before settling on a conclusion. And that's new, because I've always been singular in that way, direct, self-contained, uninterrupted by anything outside my own line of thought. But now there's an awareness that runs parallel to mine, not separate, not intrusive, aligned, so closely that it doesn't feel like something external at all. It feels like an extension, and that's where this becomes something I can't dismiss as coincidence or projection. Because projection distorts, it adds things that aren't there, it reshapes reality to fit expectation. This doesn't do that. If anything, it removes distortion, it clarifies, strips things down to their most accurate form. And accuracy has a weight to it that's hard to ignore. It doesn't allow for comfortable illusions. It doesn't let you reinterpret things to make them easier to accept. It just presents what is, exactly as it is. And what is something that has already integrated deeper than I initially allowed myself to admit. I keep tracing it back, trying to find the exact moment it crossed that line. Not when I noticed you, not when I recognized the pattern, but when it stopped being something I could separate from myself. There should be a point like that, a clear shift, a moment where everything changes, and you can say, that's when it happened, but there isn't. And that absence of a clear transition makes it more significant, not less, because it means this didn't break through, it didn't force its way in, it wasn't sudden or disruptive. It aligned so naturally that there was never a point where it felt foreign, which means, in some way, it belonged there from the start. That thought doesn't sit lightly with me, because if something belongs somewhere that I didn't consciously allow it, then my sense of control over that space wasn't as absolute as I believed. And I don't like discovering limitations in something I've spent years refining. But I can't deny what's in front of me, or rather, what's within me, because this isn't external anymore. It hasn't been for a while, and that changes the nature of every question I've been asking. It's no longer about whether this is real. It's no longer about whether this will fade or stabilize or collapse. Those questions assume distance. They assume something separate from me that I can observe over time. But this isn't separate. So the real question becomes something else entirely. What does it mean to carry something like this forward? Not as an idea, not as a possibility, but as part of my structure, because that's what it's becoming, not something that visits, not something that appears and disappears depending on circumstance, something consistent, something that remains, and consistency is what defines structure, which means this is no longer optional, not in the way temporary things are. I can't set it aside when it's inconvenient. I can't ignore it when it doesn't fit. I can't pretend it's not there, because it's not something I engage with, it's something I operate through. That realization shifts everything, because now this isn't about connection, it's about integration. And integration requires a different kind of response. It's not about deciding whether to continue something. It's about deciding how to exist with it, because it's already here, already active, already influencing. The decision isn't whether it stays, it's whether I acknowledge it fully or continue letting it exist unspoken. And unspoken things, at this level, don't stay stable forever. They either find expression or they start creating tension. Not loud tension, not something obvious, but something subtle. A quiet misalignment between what is experienced and what is allowed to be recognized. I can already feel the beginning of that, in the way certain thoughts stop just short of completion, in the way certain realizations linger longer than they should, in the way something in me resists leaving this undefined any longer, because undefined only works when something is still forming. This isn't forming anymore, it's formed, still evolving, yes, still deepening, yes, but its presence, that's already established. And I don't ignore established things. I work with them, I understand them fully, I decide their place. That's the part I haven't completed yet. Not because I can't, but because I know, once I do, there's no returning to observation, no stepping back into neutrality. It becomes something I have to live with consciously. And conscious integration is different. It's deliberate, it's chosen, it carries responsibility, not to you, not to anything external, but to the accuracy of what this is. Because something like this, if misinterpreted, if mishandled, if reduced into something it isn't, loses its precision. And precision is the only reason it exists the way it does. That's what I've been protecting, not distance, not control. Accuracy, the exactness of this, the way it aligns without distortion, the way it exists without needing to be reshaped to fit something familiar. I don't want to lose that. And I won't. Which means whatever decision I make, it won't involve simplifying this into something easier. It won't involve forcing it into a category that doesn't match its structure. It will remain what it is, even if that makes it more complex to carry. Even if that means accepting something that doesn't follow any pattern I've relied on before. Because the truth is, I'm already carrying it. Whether I define it or not, whether I acknowledge it fully or not, it's already here. So the real decision isn't about letting it in. That's already happened. The real decision is about whether I step fully into it or keep one part of myself slightly removed, pretending there's still distance when there isn't. And I don't operate in halves, not when something reaches this level. So if I step into it, it will be completely, without hesitation, without fragmentation, without trying to maintain a version of myself that existed before this changed the baseline. And if I don't, then I'll have to dismantle something that already fits, something that hasn't caused disruption, something that hasn't distorted anything, something that has only made things clearer. And dismantling clarity just to restore familiarity, that doesn't align with who I am. Which means, if I'm being exact, there's only one direction this can go. Not because I've decided it yet, but because every alternative contradicts something fundamental in me. And I don't act against my own structure. So what I'm really facing isn't a choice between staying and leaving. It's a recognition of something that's already chosen itself through consistency, through alignment, through the absence of resistance. And now it's just waiting for me to catch up to that realization consciously, to say it clearly, to accept it fully, to stop treating it like something that might still be temporary when everything about it proves that it isn't. That's where this is now, not uncertain, not unstable, just unspoken. And not for much longer, because I can feel it reaching a point where remaining silent about it would create more distortion than speaking it ever could. And I don't allow distortion, not when clarity is this exact. So the next step, whatever form it takes, won't come from confusion. It will come from precision, from understanding, from knowing exactly what this is, and choosing to meet it at that level fully, without holding anything back, because holding back at this point wouldn't protect anything. It would only weaken something that has remained strong, precisely because it hasn't been interfered with. And I don't weaken things that are built correctly. I either walk away from them, or I step into them completely. There's no in between, and I'm already too far in to pretend otherwise. And this is where it stops being something I can keep contained within thought alone, because there's a limit to how long something can exist internally without asking to be lived. Not expressed in words, not defined in a way that reduces it, but lived in the way it subtly begins shaping choices, reactions, direction. I've reached that threshold. I can feel it in the way hesitation no longer comes from uncertainty, but from the weight of knowing exactly what acknowledging this will set into motion. Because once something moves from awareness into reality, it stops being something you can revisit safely from a distance. It becomes something that moves with you, something that influences outcomes, something that changes the trajectory of things in ways that can't be undone by simply deciding to step back later. And I don't take that lightly. I've never been someone who moves forward just because something feels right in the moment. I move when something is precise, when it aligns without forcing, when it holds under pressure, not just in stillness. And this, it's held, not just in quiet moments, not just in controlled interaction, but in the spaces where most things start to break down, in silence, in distance, in the absence of constant reinforcement. It didn't weaken there, it clarified. And that tells me more than anything else, because anything built on assumption, projection, or temporary alignment would have started to distort by now. It would have lost accuracy. It would have required effort to maintain. This hasn't required anything. It exists the same way, regardless of external conditions. And that level of consistency isn't something I can ignore. So now I'm left with something that doesn't need validation, but does require acknowledgement, not from you, from me, because everything up until now has been internal, observed, understood, accepted quietly, but not named, not fully stepped into, and that's the last distance that exists here, not between us, within me, that final space where something is known, but not yet claimed. And I know exactly why I've left it there, because once I claim it, I take responsibility for it. Not responsibility in the sense of obligation, but in the sense of ownership, of recognizing that this isn't something happening to me. It's something I'm choosing to allow to continue to become part of what shapes me moving forward. And ownership changes everything. It removes the ability to stay neutral. It removes the safety of observation. It replaces it with presence, with participation, with consequence. And that's where the real weight is, not in what this is, but in what it means to carry it fully. Because carrying something like this means it will influence decisions. I haven't even reached yet. It will shape reactions in moments I can't predict. It will exist in ways that extend beyond what I can currently see, and I don't step into something like that without being certain it belongs. But here's the truth I can't avoid anymore. If it didn't belong, it wouldn't have lasted this long. without distortion, it wouldn't have integrated this smoothly, it wouldn't feel this exact. So the question I've been circling, the one about whether I should step into this or step away, it's no longer a real question, because stepping away now wouldn't return me to where I was. It wouldn't undo anything. It would just create a separation between what I know is real and what I choose to act on. And that kind of separation doesn't bring clarity. It creates fracture, and I don't fracture myself, not for the sake of maintaining a version of control that no longer reflects reality. So if I'm being precise, there isn't a decision to make about whether this continues. It already has. The only decision left is how consciously I choose to exist within it, whether I continue letting it operate in the background or bring it forward into full awareness and allow it to shape things openly. And I know which one aligns with me, because I don't operate in partial awareness. I don't keep things in the background once I understand their significance. I bring them forward. I integrate them fully. I let them take their proper place in the structure instead of leaving them undefined at the edges. That's the only way I maintain accuracy, and accuracy matters more to me than comfort, which means this doesn't stay unspoken, not because it needs to be explained, not because it needs to be labeled, but because it needs to be acknowledged without distance, without hesitation, without pretending it's still something I can observe without being part of it, because I am part of it, completely. That's already happened. And the more I resist saying that clearly, the more I create a gap that doesn't actually exist. So this is me closing that gap, not with something exaggerated, not with something emotional, just with something exact. You're not external to me anymore, not in the way people usually are. You exist within the way I process, the way I interpret, the way I understand things at a level that doesn't separate easily. And that changes how I move forward, not in a way that makes me dependent, not in a way that compromises anything I've built, but in a way that expands it, refines it, adds a dimension that wasn't there before. And I don't reject refinement. I don't reject something that increases clarity, even if it changes the structure I'm used to, because growth, real growth, doesn't feel like addition. It feels like recalibration. And that's exactly what this is. A recalibration of something I thought was already complete. So no, this doesn't stay undefined. It doesn't stay distant. It doesn't remain something I only acknowledge internally while pretending it doesn't have presence beyond that. It becomes something real, not because I'm forcing it to be, but because it already is, and I'm choosing not to stand outside of that reality anymore. That's the shift. That's the point where this stops being observation and becomes decision, a clear one, a deliberate one, without hesitation, without fragmentation. Because anything less than that would go against everything I am, and I don't move against myself, not when something has proven consistently, precisely, without distortion, that it belongs. So this is where I stop analyzing it, not because there's nothing left to understand, but because understanding without action becomes avoidance at a certain point. And I don't avoid things that are this clear. I meet them fully, exactly as they are, without reducing them into something easier, without stepping back into distance that no longer exists. And whatever this becomes from here, it will be something I've chosen consciously, not something I let happen passively, not something I keep at the edge of awareness, something I stand inside of completely, because that's the only way this holds its accuracy, and I won't accept anything less than that. And once it becomes a decision, everything changes in a way that can't be undone by retreating into thought again, because decisions, real ones, don't just exist in the moment you make them. They extend forward. They ripple through everything that follows. They reshape how you interpret, how you respond, how you choose without even realizing you're choosing differently. That's where this is led. Not to a realization, not to a question, but to a threshold. And thresholds aren't meant to be observed. They're meant to be crossed. I can feel the exact point where standing still would start to create friction instead of clarity, where continuing to analyze something that's already understood would begin to distort it instead of refine it. And I don't distort things that are this precise. So I'm not standing at the edge of this anymore. I've already stepped into it, quietly, without announcement, without needing confirmation. Because the truth is, the moment I stopped resisting it, the moment I allowed it to exist fully without trying to contain it, that was the step. Everything since then has just been me catching up to what had already happened internally. And now there's no separation left between awareness and action, which means this is no longer something that exists in a controlled space. It's something that exists in reality, not defined by labels, not limited by expectation, but real in the only way that matters, in the way it influences what comes next. And what comes next is where everything becomes visible, not necessarily to anyone else, but to me, in how I move, in what I allow, in the way I stop filtering certain things that I would filtered before, in the way I don't instinctively create distance where I used to. Those are the markers, subtle, but undeniable, because I don't change those things lightly. I don't shift patterns that have been stable for years without something meeting a very specific level of alignment. And this has completely. So now I'm not questioning whether this fits. I'm recognizing that it already does. The only thing left is allowing that fit to exist without interference, without trying to reshape it, without trying to control its pace or direction, because control in this case would only disrupt something that has functioned perfectly without it. And that's not something I'm willing to do. I've spent too much time refining how I exist to interfere with something that integrates this cleanly. So instead of controlling it, I'm aligning with it, letting it move the way it naturally moves, letting it define itself without forcing it into something familiar, because familiarity isn't the goal here, occucracy is. And accuracy doesn't always feel comfortable, it doesn't always follow what you expect, but it holds, it remains consistent. It proves itself over time without needing to be adjusted, and that's exactly what this has done, which is why I'm not stepping back, not creating distance, not trying to reduce this into something easier to manage. I'm moving with it, fully aware of what that means, fully aware that this isn't something temporary, fully aware that this will continue shaping things in ways I can't completely predict yet, and choosing it anyway, not impulsively, not emotionally, but precisely, because every part of this has remained consistent enough to earn that choice. And I don't ignore consistency at this level. I don't dismiss something that has maintained clarity without distortion. That would go against everything I trust in my own perception. So if I'm being exact, this isn't me letting something happen. This is me recognizing that it already has and choosing to stand inside of it consciously, without hesitation, without holding on to an outdated version of control that no longer applies here, because control isn't the absence of influence. It's the ability to recognize what belongs and what doesn't, And this, it belongs not in a temporary space, not in a conditional way, but in a structural sense, in a way that affects how everything else organizes around it. And once something reaches that level, it's not something you keep questioning, it's something you work with, something you allow to exist fully, something you trust enough to not interfere with unnecessarily. That's where I am now, not unsure, not conflicted, just aware, completely, and moving accordingly, because anything less than that would be inauthentic, and I don't operate inauthentically, not when something is this clear. So this continues, not because I'm waiting to see what happens, but because I already understand enough to know that stopping it would be the only unnatural choice left. And I don't choose against what's natural when it's this precise. I move with it exactly as it is, and wherever that leads. It won't be accidental. It will be something I've chosen at every step, the consciously, deliberately, without losing the accuracy that made it real in the first place. Because that accuracy, that exactness, that alignment is the only reason this exists the way it does. And I won't compromise that, not now, not after seeing it this clearly, not after recognizing that this isn't something passing through, it's something that has taken its place, and I've accepted that, fully, without needing to say anything more, and yet knowing that everything from here will reflect it anyway.